Step back into the year 1882, somewhere in the American South. Inside a photography studio, a family is posing for a portrait. They are formal, dignified, and dressed in their finest attire, a frozen moment meant to assert their presence in an era that often sought to diminish it. But look closer. At the very edge of the frame stands a young girl, no more than 7 years old. For over 140 years, the world overlooked her gaze, unaware that her eyes held a biological key. This was a genetic cipher that had survived systemic erasure and generations of forced silence, waiting for the moment it would finally be unlocked. Dr. James Okafor, a specialist in ancestral reconstruction at Howard University, has spent 15 years reclaiming stories swallowed by the void of history. One rainy morning, a woman named Diane arrived with a fragile envelope held tightly to her chest. Inside was a cabinet card from 1882, devoid of names, locations, or even a studio stamp which had been deliberately scraped away. Who were these 7 souls? Why was their identity so meticulously scrubbed from the record? As James brought his magnifying glass to the young girl's eyes at the far right of the frame, his breath caught. Under digital magnification, a rare physical trait emerged. It wasn't just a quirk of nature. It was a genetic marker, a living bridge to an origin story that had been systematically dismantled by the passage of time. DNA possesses a memory that history cannot burn. Even when records are destroyed, our biology retains the blueprints of our ancestors. If stories of rediscovered identity move, you subscribe to this channel and join us as we reveal what was hidden in plain sight within a child's gaze. Dr. James Okafor's magnifying glass moved with the cold precision of a forensic investigator. He methodically cataloged the structural markers, the high-collared suits of the boys, the professional grade of the photographic paper, and the painted garden backdrop characteristic of the post-war American South. Everything signaled a family of intention people who chose to be remembered with dignity and professional clarity. But as the lens hovered over the youngest girl at the far right, the methodology of history was shattered by an ocular paradox. She had tilted her head slightly, just as the shutter fired, exposing a secret that had remained dormant for over a century. Her eyes were an impossible mismatch. The left eye was a uniform deep darkness, an expected vessel of pigmentation, but the right eye was a reflective outlier, carrying a pale, ghostly quality that pierced through the sepia tones. James immediately transitioned from analog observation to digital interrogation. He spent 12 minutes scanning the artifact at peak resolution, adjusting gamma and sharpening focus without compromising the original file's integrity. When the girl's face finally filled the monitor in hyper detail, James leaned back, enveloped in a profound, heavy silence. He wasn't just staring at a rare biological trait. He was staring at a rupture in the narrative of identity. What was hidden in that pale gaze that could rewrite the history of an entire lineage. Join us as we peel back the final digital layer of this 140-year-old mystery. The right eye was blue-gray. It was an unmistakable piercing clarity captured within the silver grains of 1882. For a black child in the post-Reconstruction era to possess an eye the color of a winter sea was more than a rarity. It was a biological manifesto. Dr. James Okafor realized he wasn't just examining a vintage portrait. He was interrogating a genetic metadata file. Diane, the guardian of the image, possessed only a fragment of oral history, a mandate passed down through 4 generations of women. Keep this, it matters. No names, no records, only the shadow of an old woman who insisted on its preservation. But James spoke a different lexicon, the language of the genome. He bypassed historical archives for medical databases, searching for a specific signature, Waardenburg Syndrome, type 2A. This wasn't merely a medical condition, it was an autosomal dominant key. Its implications were staggering. The mutation requires only one parent to manifest its vivid traits. It acts as a biological lantern, appearing in roughly half of each generation with relentless consistency. It leaves indelible marks, eyes of mismatched colors, or a striking silver forelock. That pale, luminous eye was a clandestine thread running backward through the void of history. If this child in 1882 carried the mark, she inherited it from a ghost who inherited it from another. It was a biological signal that survived the fires of slavery and the erasure of names refusing to be silenced. This child, James said, his voice anchored in the weight of discovery, is a living transmission. She carries a code that history tried to burn, but DNA refused to forget. Genetic mutations do not fade. They simply wear different masks. Dr. James Okafor realized he was looking at a bifurcated biological map. While the youngest sister held the sea in her gaze, the older sister, seated with stoic grace, bore a different hallmark. Through digital enhancement, a striking patch of white hair emerged above her left temple. It was a pale beacon, flying at the edge of her dark hairline. One sister inherited the chromatic shift in the iris. The other inherited the absence of pigment in the hair. Both are classic signatures of Waardenburg Syndrome. This confirmed a cold scientific reality. The genetic thread was unbroken. It didn't skip. It flowed directly from one of the parents standing at the center of the frame. But here lies the enigma. The father's gaze was direct and symmetrical, his biology seemingly silent. The mother, however, was framed by a compositional void. A deep shadow obscured her features, a 140-year-old technical oversight, or perhaps a deliberate mask. James knew that to see through the darkness, he needed a specialist in the invisible. He called Dr. Patricia Euan a cipher hunter of the genome. "I need you to tell me what that shadow is protecting," he whispered. The silence of the 1880s was about to meet the digital interrogation of the 21st century at 8 a.m. Dr. Patricia Euan didn't just observe, she interrogated the void. "The shadow isn't hiding her gaze," she remarked. "It's shielding a legacy." As digital filters pushed the limits of the 1882 artifact, the truth of the mother emerged. At the very edge of the artificial darkness was a sliver of light, a white forelock mirroring her daughter's. She was the primary transmission. Armed with this biological certainty, Dr. James Okafor dived into the archives of the erased, the Freedmen's Bureau records. At 11:47 a.m., a digital miracle surfaced. A labor contract from 1866 in South Carolina bore a singular name, Eliza. Beside her name, a bureau agent had recorded a parenthetical detail that changed everything. One eye, brown, one eye, gray, blue. distinctive. That sentence sat on the screen like a stone dropped into still water. Eliza, born around 1831, stripped of a surname, isolated by a systemic void. Yet her biology had authored an infallible signature that no official decree could erase. The name Eliza was no longer a ghost. It was a biological anchor. It provided James with the coordinates to enter a much darker archive. The slave manifests the cold industrial ledgers of human transport. The search for Eliza was about to enter the heart of a cargo of silence, where identities were lost but DNA remained defiant. History is often preserved in the coldest of ink. Slave manifests were never intended to document humanity. They were industrial ledgers, shipping receipts for property that listed names, ages, and heights. Yet in the brutal precision of these records, the blueprint of a soul was inadvertently saved. After 48 hours of scouring national archives, Dr. James Okafor struck a digital vein. A coastal shipping record from 1849, Charleston, South Carolina. Among the souls listed was an 18-year-old girl named Eliza. Beside her description, the agent had scribbled 2 words that bridged 175 years of silence: eyes different. In the transactional language of the 19th century, her most profound genetic inheritance, the very thing that made her unique, had been recorded as a mere curiosity. But today, those 2 words function as a biological fingerprint. They confirm that the girl on that ship is the same woman who would stand proudly in a photography studio 3 decades later. As James shared this discovery with Diane, the air in the room shifted. The name Eliza carried a new heavy resonance. She was no longer a fragment of a lost genealogy. She was a woman with a name, a trajectory, and a defiant biological trait that no ledger could erase. But the final mystery remained. Where did Eliza come from before the docks of Charleston? To find the answer, James moved beyond paper. He turned to the cutting edge of phenotypic reconstruction and Diane's own DNA. The map of their ancestry wasn't just in the archives anymore, it was in their blood. The quest for origin moved from the paper archives into the river of existence, mitochondrial DNA. Dr. Patricia initiated a deep sequencing of the maternal line, constructing a molecular bridge from the present back to the absolute beginning. The results carried the restrained electricity of a scientific breakthrough. Haplogroup L3, specifically a subclade anchored to a narrow geographical corridor in West Africa, Sierra Leone. Furthermore, the specific PAX3 mutation causing Eliza's different eyes was a biological signature documented in only one group in existing records, the Mende people. The Mende, historically targeted during the final intense eras of maritime trafficking, saw their social structures fractured by the tides of history. Yet this rare genetic marker functioned as a biological lighthouse, a signal that refused to be extinguished by time or distance. While searching the Amidst Research Center, Dr. James stumbled upon a miracle, a handwritten letter from 1891. The author, a woman once known by another name but now called Eliza, wrote in the deliberate English of a resilient survivor. She chronicled a childhood by a river and a journey into the unknown, but it was a passage near the end that anchored the entire mystery. My mother had eyes that did not match, one dark as river mud, one pale as morning sky. She told me it was the sign of our origin, and no matter how far we were taken, that sign would follow us. This wasn't just a physical trait. It was a manifesto of continuity. When James read these words to Diane, her reaction wasn't a cry or a word, it was the sound of a century-old silence, finally breaking a lineage, recognizing itself across the vastness of the Atlantic. The odyssey of the 1882 portrait has reached its final resonant destination. It is a journey that bypassed the fallibility of paper and anchored itself in the absolute truth of biology. Eliza, the woman once known only by a generic name on a labor contract, had preserved everything in the private sanctuary of her memory, her village, her mother, and the geography of the Sewa River. Every vector of evidence now points to the Mende heartland of Sierraleone mitochondrial DNA, direct maternal link to the L3 haplogroup. The Waardenburg variant, a genetic fingerprint unique to the Sewa corridor. The 1891 letter A, soulful confirmation of the river mud and morning sky eyes. The 1882 portrait, the visual transmission of a defiant lineage. Consider the 7-year-old girl at the edge of the frame in 1882. She stood there a century and a half ago, unaware that her different eyes were actually a biological compass. Her heterochromia was the signal that would eventually guide a future historian back to the specific riverbank where her great-great-grandmother's story was violently interrupted in the 1830s. This is the power of the unbreakable biological record. It is a ledger that outlasts the ships, the auctions, and the deliberate erasures of history. It proves that identity is not something that can be stripped away. It is woven into the very fabric of our cells, waiting for someone to look closely enough to recognize the map. Tomorrow, when James speaks to Diane, he won't just be delivering data. He will be returning a river, a people, and a name that history tried to bury, but DNA refused to forget. Six weeks after that first rainy morning, Diane returned to Dr. James Okafor's office. The photograph, a physical vessel guarded by 4 generations of women, sat between them, once more silent, yet radiating a newly discovered power. James didn't merely present a file. He had constructed a staircase of generations. Each document functioned as a step descending from a photography studio in 1882 back to a sun-drenched riverbank in West Africa, the Freedmen's Bureau records. The first echoes of a reclaimed life. The 1866 labor contract. The emergence of the name Eliza from the void. The 1849 Slave Manifest, a moment of brutal transaction that inadvertently preserved a biological fingerprint, the mitochondrial DNA analysis, the molecular bridge spanning the Atlantic, the 1891 letter and historical maps, the final confirmation of the Sewa River Valley and the Mende people. Diane held the printed letter, her eyes tracing the passage about the mismatched eyes, one dark as river mud, one pale as morning sky. She gazed at the little girl on the far right of the frame a century and a half ago. "She didn't know," Diane whispered. She didn't know her eyes were a map, a manifesto, a promise that her origin could never be truly erased. The 7-year-old child in 1882 stood there in absolute innocence, unaware that she was a biological beacon transmitting the frequency of a lost homeland. She was the living proof that while paper can burn and names can be stripped away, the archives within our cells are an impregnable fortress of truth. The Odyssey ends not with a roar, but with a sacred silence. It is a reminder that identity is not a gift from history, but an inheritance from the blood, one that waits patiently for the light of recognition to find it. The final exchange between Dr. James and Diane was no longer an academic exercise. It was a reckoning. The 7-year-old girl in the 1882 portrait might never have grasped the magnitude of her own gaze, but her ancestor Eliza knew exactly what she was preserving. She authored a truth in a language that wasn't hers within a system designed to silence her and left it as a clandestine transmission for the future. It took 140 years for the world to acquire the tools to decode it. This family's lineage was subjected to deliberate systemic erasure, first by the machinery of oppression, then by the indifference of history. But the erasure was never absolute, because encoded within the biological manuscript of that child, within the very geometry of her iris, was a record no document could destroy. The frequency of her ancestry flowed from the banks of the Sewa River in Sierraleone across the vast Atlantic, surviving the ledgers and the auctions to emerge triumphant under the studio lights of South Carolina. Diane gathered the photograph, pressing it to her chest, the same protective gesture she held 6 weeks ago in the rain. But now she wasn't carrying a mystery. She was carrying sovereignty. She finally knew the name Eliza, and she understood that the true original name of her lineage was still vibrating somewhere along the Sewa. DNA does not forget. It cannot be confiscated, burned, or renamed. It simply waits. And eventually, the silence is broken by those who learn to read the map within the blood. Legacy isn't found in monuments. It flows through your very veins. Subscribe to join us in decoding the forgotten biological manuscripts of history, like to illuminate the truths that were once buried in silence. Comment: does your family carry a hidden cipher from the past? Thank you for watching. See you in the next decoding journey.